Okay, so, well, this is a healthy lifestyle. As you can see, you're doing all the healthy things, and there's coconut there. So the title of my talk is Developing a Coconut Strategy for the 21st Century. And this is the outline of my study. First, I'll talk about a new paradigm for saturated fat is needed, which is actually the theme of this seminar. And then second, I'll talk about the threat of ultra-processed foods and how can we promote the coconut. So, a new paradigm is needed for saturated fat. So in this section, I will talk about what are saturated fats and the guidelines against saturated fats and coconut oil, which are erroneous. So first, understanding fat. What's the first thing you think about when you say fat? When you hear the word fat? This is what you think about. Fat people. Unfortunately, these biases are thinking about fat because the other one, the figure on the right, is also what the fat is, and that's the structure of a triglyceride fat. And here I've labeled 3 fatty acids. We have lauric acid, which is the first one. Second one is oleic acid, and the third one is I put omega-3, but that's linoleic acid. And these two are not the same. So unfortunately, whenever we avoid, we say that, oh, you don't like fat because you're thinking about what's on the left. But really, what we're talking about is what's on the right, which is more important. Because if you understand what fat is, then it will make you avoid becoming fat. So let's talk about the fatty acid profile of coconut oil. Many of you already probably know this. These are the fatty acid components of coconut oil. Now there are two two columns there. One is coconut oil, is grams per 100 grams of the fatty acid. And the second one, which is probably more familiar, is the percent fatty acid profile. In both cases, well, the more precise definition is really the one in the middle, grams of fatty acid per 100 grams of the oil. As you can see, but in both cases, the total medium fatty acid is quite high, 54.5 grams per 100 grams, or 63% medium fatty acids. Now, if you compare coconut oil with other common comparators, you have lard, tallow, butter, beef meat, you can see that coconut oil is really unique in the fatty acid profile, where it is highest in amount of medium chain fatty acids. Lard, tallow, butter, beef meat hardly have any medium chain fatty acids. So the total medium chain fatty acid is given there at the second to the bottom row. And then another important aspect is that coconut oil really has no cholesterol. It's 0 milligrams per 100 grams cholesterol, while the others have quite high levels of cholesterol. Unfortunately, the dietary guidelines for Americans have been campaigning against cardiovascular disease, and it was a campaign against saturated fat. So as you can see, it started in 1980, and 1980, 1985, we said avoid too much fat, saturated fat and cholesterol. And then 1990 and 1995, it became choose a diet low in fat, saturated fat and cholesterol, which is basically the same. Year 2000, limit foods high in saturated fat and cholesterol, and then limit the intake of saturated fat, trans fat and cholesterol. Finally, they added trans fat after many years. And then 2010, 2015, 2020, they specified consume less than 10% of calories from saturated fatty acids by replacing them with monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids. So from 2010, they started to advocate a specific target for saturated fatty acids and to replace saturated fatty acids with either monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids. But then later you'll see that it's really the polyunsaturated fatty acids is what they were really about. They wanted to put big consumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So is saturated fat really the cause of cardiovascular disease? The rationale for the dietary guidelines for Americans was to address the increase in cardiovascular disease among the Americans. Now this is a key article in 1961 where the American Heart Association said that the reduction of fats consumption under medical supervision with reasonable substitutes of polyunsaturated fat for saturated fats is recommended as a possible means of preventing atherosclerosis and decreasing the risk of heart attacks and strokes. This recommendation is based on the best scientific information available at the present time. Now, what is ironic here is that this is 1961, it's 2023, and this is still what they're advocating. So in other words, you would think that within those 70 years or 60 years, there's no better scientific evidence to replace that recommendation. And then in 2017, the American Heart Association said dietary fats and cardiovascular disease, where they had a special section of coconut oil. And here they said, a recent survey reported that 72% of American public rated coconut oil as a healthy food compared with 37% of nutritionists. This disconnect between lay and expert opinion can be attributed to the marketing of coconut oil in the popular press. In other words, they were complaining that the Americans were taking coconut oil because of social media, when in fact, probably they weren't believing the American Heart Association as much anymore. So is saturated fat the cause of obesity? Well, this figure shows the past and projected overweight rates, and this is from a NIH study from 1999 to 2007. The dietary guidelines was started in 1980, and you can see that obesity increased after 1980 or around 1980, and the projection is actually for overweight to keep increasing, which it has. Now, the evidence against saturated fat really comes from studies of the Western diet. This is a paper from the Cochrane Library. This is supposed to be a prestigious group. They do international group that does meta-analysis of various studies. This was published in 2015, but then also be published in 2020. But here, and the list on the left are those studies which they did analysis on. The papers which were reviewed were published from 1965 to 2006. But these studies were conducted in North America, 7 studies, Europe, 8 studies, Australia and New Zealand, 2 studies, but no studies were carried out in industrializing or developing countries. In addition, medium-chain fatty acids and long-chain fatty acids were not differentiated, so they just referred to them as just saturated fat. And there's no mention of coconut oil in the entire review. But then this paper is used to say that coconut oil is unhealthy when there was no coconut oil at all in these studies. Now, the evidence against saturated fat is really very weak. This is a recent study in 2023. Saturated fat, the estimated absolute risk and certainty of risk for mortality, a major cancer, and cardiometabolic outcomes, an overview systematic study. And here they say the main limitations of all these studies were deficient reporting of study selection. In other words, the studies were selected based on criteria which did not fit, did not qualify as a good study. Absolute effect estimates, in other words, they don't give the absolute effect, they give the relative effect, which increases or appears to increase the effect. Sources of funding, so there's bias, and a priori subgroups explore heterogeneity. In other words, the studies were not well designed among the subjects. So the conclusion of the study is that the data is primarily based on low and very low certainty evidence. In other words, all the studies that have been made is really based on very weak studies. So will the dietary authorities listen to this new evidence? Medium-chain fatty acids are metabolically different from long-chain fatty acids. So the study is saying that short-chain fatty acids and medium-chain fatty acids modulate mitochondrial energy production, which promotes thermogenesis. So this is a very important study because it differentiates medium-chain fatty acids from long-chain fatty acids. And secondly, this study really differentiates palmitic acid from lauric acid. Palmitic acid is a long-chain fatty acid, it's 16 carbons long. Lauric acid is 12 carbons long. And as it says in the conclusions, lauric acid, as opposed to palmitic acid, did not trigger pathogenic mechanisms which are linked to insulin resistance. And lauric acid represents a healthy saturated fatty acid. Now, the reason why this paper is significant is because almost all the studies in saturated fat use palmitic acid as the model fatty acid. So the basis for the results of studies on saturated fats are really based on studies using palmitic acid and not lauric acid. But these two acids are very different. Medium-chain fatty acids promote healthy metabolism. So this paper, Role of Medium-Chain Fatty Acids in Healthy Metabolism, a Clinical Perspective. Medium-chain fatty acids serve not only as energy source, but also regulate glucose and lipid metabolism. So this is important because we think of fats as sources of energy, but actually medium-chain fatty acids also have regulatory functions. In particular, they regulate glucose and lipid metabolism. Medium-chain fatty acids and their ketone products modulate cellular signaling and regulate key circulating metabolites and hormones. Medium-chain fatty acids increase mitochondrial oxidative capacity and insulin sensitivity. And they, as we'll see later, medium-chain fatty acids have the potential for treating metabolic and neurological disorders. So medium-chain fatty acids have really a lot of potential. Now VCO, which is 64% medium-chain fatty acids, promotes a healthy metabolism. These two studies, the one on the left is on males. To be fair, the one on the right is on women. They both studies used the same amount of VCO, although the number of features slightly was different. But in both cases, the VCO addressed obesity in males and in women. And the paper on the bottom, the third one, the conclusion was that VCO reduced body mass, adiposity, and liver fat, hepatic cholesterol, and triglyceride levels, and improved hormonal parameters. So clearly, VCO promotes good metabolism. A new approach to saturated fat is needed. This is a paper written by one of our speakers later, Professor Arne Astrup, recommends that WHO draft guidelines on dietary saturated and trans fat acids. There's a need for a new approach. So basically, he's saying that the WHO dietary guidelines need to be revised to look at the all these nutrients and look at not just the individual components, but make it a food-based recommendation. So you don't just recommend a particular fatty acid, but the whole food. So you study the effects of VCO, for example. Coconut oil. But will the dietary authorities listen to the new evidence? So this just came out recently. WHO updates guidelines on fats and carbohydrates. And here, they said adults should limit total fat intake to 30% of total energy or less. This is actually the same as the dietary guidelines for Americans. And they also say that everyone should consume no more than 10% of total energy coming from saturated fat. So it seems that there's nothing new with the WHO, because isn't this a diet that's been making Americans fat? Now let's look at at the threat of ultra-processed foods. And here I'll define what ultra-processed foods are and why it is unhealthy. The Dietary Guidelines actually promotes ultra-processed foods, and the WHO Trans Fat Replace program also promotes ultra-processed food. So what are ultra-processed foods? Ultra-processed foods are packaged foods that have been made by food companies using many manufactured ingredients rather than actual foods. These ingredients are combined in some way to make something that is edible. In fact, they make it much too edible. You get hooked up on it. But in no way maintains integrity or nutritional content of the original foods. Ultra-processed foods generally contain additives, preservatives, and other substances extracted from foods, and they've been linked to cancer and heart disease, among other conditions. So this is from the MD Anderson Cancer Center. So is there a link between ultra-processed foods and obesity? Well, this document came out in 2003. Here, the Pacific Island societies actually became obese with the Western diet. So in Polynesia, 50 years ago, and since this was published in 2003, this would have been around 1950, so 50 years ago, in 1950, fat provided 38 to 42% of energy, and over 62% of fat came from coconut cream, and Polynesians and Micronesians may have consistently consumed a diet high in fat. However, with increasing urbanization, traditional foods were quickly supplemented with foreign foods. The urban diet included imported oil, and that's probably corn oil and soybean oil, and margarine. In 1998, people were 2.2 times more likely to be obese and 2.4 times more likely to be diabetic if they ate imported fats than if they ate traditional foods. So this is really the beginnings of ultra-processed food. At this time, people weren't talking about ultra-processed foods yet, but clearly the effects of ultra-processed foods were already being seen in the Pacific Island population. So ultra-processed foods have a direct effect on the positive correlation of ultra-processed food consumption and obesity. So this figure really shows that as the amount of ultra-processed foods consumed increases, obesity also increases. And there is a link also between ultra-processed foods and cardiovascular disease. So, this is a study, ultra-processed foods and incidence of cardiovascular disease in the Framingham Offspring Study. So Framingham is a town in Massachusetts, which they've been studying since around the 1960s. And here, they show that the current findings support the conclusion that higher consumption of ultra-processed food is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, incidence, and mortality. So as you can see from the graph, as the amount of ultra-processed food consumed increases, so does cardiovascular disease. Now let's go to the WHO Trans Fat Replace program. Now this particular document was released in 2019, and the WHO has been going worldwide, saying let's remove trans fat from from our food. So they have this Trans Fat Replace program. So what are the details of the Trans Fat Replace program? So this is from the 2019 version, and as you can see on this table, coconut oil is down at the bottom, and they are not recommending coconut oil. So that's on the lower right. And what they're promoting are high PUFA diets. These are diets which have, for example, high soybean. So this one move. There you go. There's coconut oil. And it's down at the bottom, it's not recommended. So you look at this WHO Trans Fat Replace, it's really looks like there's a hidden agenda to this program. Now this is the 2021 version, which is, they dropped the table, but if you look at the fine print, it it says there to remove support for, I can't read it so well, reduce or eliminate subsidies if present in oils which are fats which are high in saturated fatty acids. In other words, if you were providing funding for coconut oil, then you should remove that support. Now, can you go back? The next citation there, assessment of trans fatty acid content of food. Sorry, it's probably a bit difficult to read. It's also difficult to read from up here. But it's supposed to address trans fatty acid. But if you look at the text, it includes trans fatty acid and saturated fatty acid. So under the guise of replacing trans fat, they're throwing in the warnings also against saturated fatty acids. And then down at the bottom, it says mandatory limits to limit industrially produced trans fatty acid to a percentage of total fats less than 2 grams per 100 grams. In other words, make it lower than 2%. So this is supposed to be replace trans fatty acid program, but they're still allowing industrial trans fatty acids up to 2%. And that's exactly what the US FDA is also recommending. So you wonder whether this program is really, well, it looks like as you can see, that cartoon. The devil is really in the details. This program seeks to discourage the saturated fat, which would include coconut oil. Now, ultra-processed food consumption is also bad for the environment. So in this study, it says low consumption of ultra-processed foods may contribute to environmental sustainability. So the less ultra-processed foods you consume, the better for the environment. The processing level of the consumed food should be considered not only for nutritional advice on health, but also for environmental protection. So there you have a photo of Brazil. They've cleared the Amazon forest to plant more soybean. So the ultra-processed foods and the WHO Trans Fat Program are threats to coconut and sustainable development. So how can we promote the coconut? Now, I'll briefly talk about this NOVA scale, which is it's about 5 years, I think 5 or 7 years old now. It ranks, describes the types of food you should be consuming. Create a healthy and sustainable coconut-based food triangle, and to oppose the ultra-processed food diet and the WHO Trans Fat Replace program. So this is NOVA scale and ultra-processed food. So group 1 are unprocessed to minimally processed food. So the examples here would be fresh fruit or dried fruit, vegetables, basically things that you buy off the wet market. They're unprocessed. Then group 2 is processed culinary ingredients. So this would be food like processing, and this could include things like butter, because butter is processed. Well, VCO would belong here. Sugar, lard, molasses, because they're undergone some processing. And then group 3 would be processed foods. These would be canned vegetables, legumes and brine, salted or sugared nuts, salted or dried cured meat and fish. Then group 4 would be the ultra-processed foods. So this would include soda, candy, chips, fries, hot dogs, processed meat, hamburgers, including Impossible Burgers. These are the plant-based so-called burgers. Pizza, donuts, trans fats, industrial fats, instant noodles. So this is the NOVA scale, which was created by Professor Monteiro from Brazil in 2010. And it's become quite useful in understanding the type of food that we should be encouraging. And what I'd like to suggest is we develop more NOVA 2 coconut products. So among the groupings, the unprocessed to minimally processed foods would be fresh coconut meat. So if you go to the vendor and buy the coconut straight from the seller, then that will be group 1, and you can drink the coconut water, that's group 1. Group 2 will be processed. So if the coconut water was bottled, then that would be group 2. VCO would also be group 2. Dried coconut meat, coconut milk, cocoa sugar, cocoa flour, coconut yogurt, nata de coco, nira, and so forth. So that would be group 2. And then group 3 coconut products would include RBD coconut oil, so it's refined, bleached, and deodorized coconut oil, and perhaps some coconut snacks. RBD coconut oil has undergone quite a number of steps to make it edible, so that's group 3. And then ultra-processed foods would include MCT oil, which are made by a chemical process, monolaurin, interesterified triglycerides. So those are group 4. Now, what I would like to suggest is that while we shouldn't stop making the other groups, perhaps we could put more focus on making processed the group 2 products. So these would be some examples. So at the bottom would be the base, so you consume more of that, and then Nova 2 would be a bit less, Nova 3 less, and Nova 1 would be, Nova 4 would be even less. So some examples would be, for Nova 1, would be a coconut diet. So just consume the coconut itself, or make curry. That would be Nova 1. Nova 2 would be some minimally processed coconut products. Doesn't want to show up. There. So those are some pictures. Of course, you have VCO, Nira, and some other coconut products. And then you would have Nova 3, with more processing. These are actually photos from the market, which you can already buy. And then Nova 4, which you would consume less of, would include monolaurin, MCT oil, and other processed products, but still coming from the coconut. So we should create this healthy coconut-based food triangle, and then try to encourage coconut industry to make more of the Nova 2 products. So the other thing we should do is oppose the ultra-processed food diet, because it is unhealthy. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans really promotes a ultra-processed food diet, and it fails the UN Sustainable Development Goals criteria. Unfortunately, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and the U.S. food industry promote an ultra-processed food diet. So this is a paper, Dietary Guidelines meet the NOVA criteria, developing a menu for a healthy dietary pattern using ultra-processed food. Unfortunately, if you look at what they made was a 91 food diet, which is 91% of calories derived from ultra-processed food, which were Nova 4 criteria. But now, if you look at the list of authors, some of them came from the USDA, but a number of them came from industry. And this article came out in The Guardian. Scientists on a panel defending ultra-processed foods linked to food firms. So almost half of the members of Dietary Guidelines for America's committee are tied to big agriculture, ultra-processed food companies, pharmaceutical companies, and other companies with a significant stake in the process outcome. So the problem now here is they want everyone to follow the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, but then it really will promote ultra-processed food. And of course, we should oppose the WHO Trans Fat Replace program. It promotes high PUFA diet, so polyunsaturated fat diet, and industrially produced fats. It still allows 2 grams of trans fatty acids per 100 grams. It fails the UN Sustainable Development criteria, and it's anti-saturated fat and anti-coconut. as we all know, and this is now a famous article, traditional Pacific societies had a high coconut diet and were healthy. So this is the private paper around 1981, published 1981, where you showed that the yeah, maybe need a little water. Sorry. So here, even with a very high saturated fat diet, there was no vascular disease in these two populations. They're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Puka Puka and Tokelau. I don't know if you can see them on the map. So they took a lot of coconut and they didn't get heart disease. So here I'm showing you the profile of coconut meat in terms of energy, protein, total fat, total dietary fiber, and their minerals. So we've been talking a lot about coconut oil, but really we should also remember that we're also trying to promote the whole coconut. And we can go back and since we've been studying the fat a lot, maybe we should also go and see what the proteins are in the coconut meat, what the dietary fibers are, what the minerals are, and how they would fit into a healthy global diet. So, again, we'd like to promote a healthy lifestyle, and hopefully, it is going to be a coconut lifestyle. So on that note, thank you for your attention.